James had lived in his home for years, tending to the lush, thriving vegetable garden his grandfather had planted decades ago. His land had a history that stretched back generations, long before the HOA had even existed. It was more than just a garden, it was a legacy, a connection to his family's past, and a source of fresh food for himself and his neighbors. But the new HOA president, Nancy Williams, saw things differently. From the moment she took over, she made it clear that James' garden was an eyesore, a violation of HOA aesthetics, and a direct challenge to her authority. At first, it was just passive-aggressive letters, sternly worded notices left on his door or mailed to him, citing obscure bylaws that James was certain didn't even apply to his property. Then came the fines, escalating each month despite his protests that his land was exempt. The harassment didn't stop at paperwork. Nancy had a way of making life miserable, turning neighbors against him by spreading rumors that he was bringing down their property values. Some of the more timid residents started avoiding him altogether, afraid of being targeted next. James, however, refused to back down. He had done his research, and he knew that his land had special legal protections. But Nancy wasn't interested in legalities. She wanted contract. One afternoon, James received a particularly aggressive violation notice, demanding that he remove his garden immediately or face daily fines and legal action. Enraged but determined, he drove down to the county clerk's office to dig into the official records. After hours of searching, he found what he was looking for, a legal loophole that gave him an ironclad defense. Decades ago, when his family had sold off portions of their vast landholdings to developers, they had retained certain rights: mineral rights, utility easements, and most importantly, an exemption from any future HOA restrictions. His property was, in legal terms, untouchable. Armed with this information, James returned home with a renewed sense of confidence. He immediately sent Nancy and the HOA's lawyer, Robert Taylor, a formal letter outlining his exemption and demanding that they cease their harassment. But he should have known that Nancy wouldn't give up so easily. The next morning, James woke up to find 3 bulldozers parked across his driveway, blocking his exit. Nancy and Robert stood in front of them, smugly watching as James stormed out of his house. "You've left us no choice, James," Nancy said, arms crossed. "The HOA has the authority to enforce community standards, and your garden has to go." But James wasn't going to let intimidation win. He pulled out his phone and started recording, documenting everything as he prepared for the next step in the fight. The confrontation escalated quickly. James, unwavering in his stance, informed Nancy and Robert that they were trespassing on his property. He explained, in precise legal terms, that the land they were standing on was part of an easement that his family had retained control over. That meant that not only were they violating his rights, but they were also opening themselves up to serious legal consequences. Nancy scoffed, waving off his claims as nonsense. "You can argue all you want, James," she sneered, "but the HOA has final say over what happens in this neighborhood." But before she could order the bulldozers to start their destruction, the unexpected happened. A county clerk's car pulled up, and out stepped Martha Gonzalez, a respected local official who had seen more than her fair share of shady HOA dealings. She held a thick file of historical documents, and with a calm but firm voice, she explained to Nancy and Robert that James was absolutely correct. His property was legally protected, and any attempt to alter it without his consent would be considered a criminal act. Nancy's face turned red with fury, but before she could argue, James pointed out another glaring issue. The bulldozers were parked directly on his easement, meaning the HOA itself was now guilty of trespassing. The tables had officially turned. Just as the tension reached a boiling point, another vehicle arrived, a sheriff's patrol car. Sheriff Martinez, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for fairness, stepped out and took one look at the situation. James wasted no time in explaining everything, from the illegal fines to the attempted destruction of his property, and most importantly, the blatant trespassing happening right in front of them. The sheriff turned to Nancy and Robert, his expression hardening. "You realize this is illegal, right?" he said flatly. "This land doesn't belong to the HOA. And those bulldozers, they're parked where they have no right to be." Nancy, for the first time, looked uncertain. Robert, however, tried to bluff his way out. "We're just enforcing community guidelines," he said smoothly. "James has been in violation for months." But Sheriff Martinez wasn't buying it. "That's not how the law works," he said. Then, as if the situation couldn't get any worse for Nancy and Robert, an elderly neighbor stepped forward, Eleanor Ramos, one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood. "This isn't just about the garden," Eleanor said, her voice strong despite her age. "Nancy and Robert have been stealing from us for years. I have proof." And with that, she revealed the financial records that would blow the entire HOA scandal wide open. Eleanor's documents were damning. According to her research, over $300,000 in HOA funds, money that was supposed to be used for a long-promised community pool renovation, had mysteriously disappeared. The money had been funneled into a private contracting company owned by none other than Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor. They had been embezzling from the community, using their power to not only steal money but also force elderly residents into selling their homes at below-market prices. James watched as the crowd of neighbors, who had gathered to witness the chaos, began murmuring angrily. They had been told for years that their HOA fees were necessary for community improvements, but now it was clear that those funds had been used for personal gain. Nancy and Robert had been running a scam, targeting the most vulnerable homeowners in an attempt to consolidate their control over the neighborhood. Sheriff Martinez wasted no time. "This just turned into a criminal investigation," he announced, signaling for his deputies. "Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor, you are both under investigation for fraud, theft, and conspiracy." Nancy's face went pale as she realized that her reign of terror was about to come to an end. But James wasn't finished yet. The community still had work to do to take back their neighborhood, and he was ready to lead the charge. With Nancy and Robert behind bars, the story of their corruption spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations picked up the footage of them vandalizing James' garden, airing it alongside reports of their fraudulent financial schemes. Soon, larger media outlets took interest, turning the scandal into a regional spectacle. The HOA corruption, the embezzled funds, and their failed attempt to seize control of the neighborhood were laid bare for everyone to see. Investigative reporters dug deeper, uncovering even more misconduct: phony maintenance fees, bogus fines imposed on selective residents, and a history of predatory tactics used against elderly homeowners. The evidence piled up, and prosecutors wasted no time filing charges against them. The trial became a high-profile case, with courtroom proceedings broadcasted on local channels. Neighbors who had suffered under Nancy and Robert's rule testified, detailing the intimidation tactics, the financial exploitation, and the hostile environment they had created. James took the stand as well, recounting the harassment over his vegetable garden and the final act of vandalism that led to their arrest. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Nancy and Robert were convicted of multiple counts of fraud, theft, conspiracy, and property damage. Their sentences were severe, reflecting not only the financial crimes but also the damage they had inflicted on an entire community. For James and his neighbors, justice had finally been served. With the corrupt HOA board officially dismantled and Nancy and Robert out of the picture, the neighborhood experienced a transformation. The toxic atmosphere that had once defined the community was gone, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and shared purpose. The new neighborhood association, led by a committee of elected homeowners, implemented fair and transparent policies. No more arbitrary fines, no more harassment, just a group of residents working together to improve their community. One of their first actions was to return all the unfairly collected fees to the affected homeowners. The missing HOA funds, recovered through the investigation, were reinvested into projects that truly benefited the neighborhood. The long-promised community pool was finally constructed, and neighbors came together to clean up and improve shared spaces. Sidewalks were repaired, playgrounds were refreshed, and community events became a regular occurrence. The sense of division that had once existed, where people feared speaking out against the HOA, was replaced with a sense of unity. The residents had taken their power back, proving that a strong community could overcome even the worst corruption. James, once seen as a troublemaker for standing up to the HOA, for James, the battle had always been about more than just his vegetable garden. It had been about standing up for his rights, exposing corruption, and protecting the place he called home. Now, with the storm behind him, he could finally focus on what he loved most: gardening. His neighbors, eager to show their support, had already helped him rebuild the garden, but James wanted to take it even further. He expanded it, adding new crops and installing a small greenhouse to grow produce year-round. What started as a personal passion project soon became something bigger. Inspired by James' fight and the way the community had come together, residents started their own home gardens. A few even proposed turning an empty lot into a community garden where everyone could grow and share food. James was more than happy to help, offering his expertise and seedlings to anyone who wanted to participate. The very thing that had sparked the conflict, the simple act of growing food, had now become a symbol of resilience and unity. Year after the ordeal, the neighborhood decided to hold an annual block party to celebrate their victory and the new beginning they had created together. The first event was a massive success. Families set up tables filled with homemade food, kids played in the newly built park, and neighbors who had once been at odds now chatted like old friends. At the center of it all was James' vegetable stand, where he shared fresh produce from his garden with anyone who wanted some. During the event, Eleanor, the elderly neighbor who had played a crucial role in exposing Nancy and Robert's fraud, approached James with a warm smile. "You didn't just save your garden," she said. "You saved all of us." James smiled, looking around at the thriving community. It was true. What had started as a personal battle had turned into something much greater, a movement that had united the neighborhood and made it stronger than Eve. As the sun set and music filled the air, James reflected on everything that had happened. The harassment, the legal battles, the threats, it had all been worth it. His garden was safe, the neighborhood was free from corruption, and most importantly, the people had reclaimed their community. The fight had been long and difficult, but in the end, they had won, with the neighborhood now in good hands. James finally had the peace he had fought so hard for. No more fines, no more harassment, just quiet mornings tending to his crops and friendly conversations with neighbors who had become like family. The experience had taught him the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what was right. He had never set out to be a leader, but in the process of defending his home, he had become one. As the years went by, the community continued to thrive. The annual block party became a beloved tradition, the community garden flourished, and the neighborhood association remained committed to fairness and transparency. James' story became somewhat of a legend, how one man's fight against corruption had sparked a movement that changed everything. And through it all, his garden stood as a testament to that victory, a vibrant, thriving symbol of perseverance, justice, and the power of a united community. As the weight of Eleanor's revelations sank in, the neighborhood erupted into chaos. People who had once remained silent out of fear were now emboldened by the truth. Furious homeowners confronted Nancy and Robert, demanding answers about the missing money and the shady real estate deals. James, sensing that this was the perfect moment to strike while the iron was hot, stepped onto his porch and called for an emergency neighborhood meeting. "We can't let them get away with this," he declared, his voice carrying over the growing crowd. "They've stolen from us, bullied us, and tried to destroy what makes this community ours. We have to take action now." The murmurs of agreement turned into loud cheers. People who had previously been too scared to challenge the HOA's authority were now standing together, realizing that they had the power to make a change. The meeting was set for that evening, and word spread like wildfire. By the time dusk fell, nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood had gathered in the local park, ready to vote on the fate of the corrupt HOA board. The atmosphere at the emergency meeting was electric. James took the lead, standing before the crowd as people demanded justice. Eleanor, backed by a few other longtime residents, presented her meticulously compiled evidence of financial fraud. She showed them bank statements, fake invoices, and records of shell companies that all pointed back to Nancy and Robert's criminal scheme. The numbers were undeniable. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned away under the guise of community improvements that never materialized. "They've been using our money to line their own pockets," Eleanor said firmly. "And they've been targeting the elderly, forcing them out of their homes so they could profit even more." A wave of outrage swept through the crowd, and calls for action grew louder. Someone shouted, "We need to vote them out, right now." And that's exactly what they did. In a unanimous decision, the community voted to immediately dissolve the HOA board and replace it with a new, fair neighborhood association. Nancy and Robert, standing off to the side, could only watch in stunned silence as their empire crumbled before their eyes. But the fight wasn't over that night. As James sat on his porch feeling the weight of everything that had happened, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "You think you've won?" Nancy's voice was low and venomous. "You have no idea what you've just done. You'll regret this." James wasn't surprised. Nancy wasn't the type to go down without a fight. "You lost, Nancy," he replied evenly. "You stole from this community, and now you're going to face the consequences." Nancy let out a bitter laugh. "We'll see about that." The call ended abruptly, leaving James with an uneasy feeling in his gut. And his instincts were right. In the early hours of the morning, the sound of shattering wood and rustling plants jolted him awake. He rushed outside, his heart pounding, only to find his beautiful vegetable garden destroyed. The wooden planter boxes had been smashed, the soil overturned, and his carefully cultivated crops ripped from the ground. A spray-painted message on his fence read, "This isn't over." But what Nancy and Robert didn't know was that James had installed security cameras weeks ago. And they had caught everything. James wasted no time. He retrieved the footage from his security cameras and immediately called the sheriff. The footage was crystal clear, Nancy and Robert, under the cover of darkness, tearing apart his garden like vengeful children throwing a tantrum. The video showed them wielding shovels and kicking over his tomato plants, laughing as they wreaked havoc. It was the final proof of their malicious intent, and James knew it would seal their fate. By the time Sheriff Martinez arrived, the news had already spread through the neighborhood. Furious residents gathered at James' house, watching the footage in disgust. "This is beyond petty," one neighbor muttered. "They lost fair and square, and now they're acting like criminals." Sheriff Martinez nodded grimly. "Because they are criminals." Within an hour, arrest warrants were issued. Deputies arrived at Nancy's house first, knocking on her door with firm authority. When she opened it and saw the officers, her face twisted with rage. "This is harassment," she shrieked, but the sheriff was unmoved. "Nancy Williams, you are under arrest for vandalism, fraud, and conspiracy," he stated, as his deputies placed her in handcuffs. Moments later, Robert Taylor was taken into custody as well. The neighborhood erupted into cheers as the corrupt duo was driven away, their reign of terror officially over. With Nancy and Robert out of the picture, the neighborhood had a rare opportunity for a fresh start. Over the next few weeks, James worked with a group of dedicated neighbors to form a new, fair association, one that prioritized transparency and the well-being of everyone, rather than lining the pockets of a few corrupt individuals. The missing HOA funds were recovered, and plans were made to finally build the long-promised community pool. But the most meaningful part of the neighborhood's transformation came in the form of unity. People who had once felt isolated under Nancy's rule now worked together to rebuild. One morning, James woke up to find a group of neighbors in his front yard, helping to restore his beloved vegetable garden. Families brought seedlings, others brought fresh soil, and within hours, the garden was more beautiful than ever. "We're not just fixing your garden," Eleanor said with a smile. "We're fixing our neighborhood." A few weeks later, the community came together for a massive block party, a celebration of their victory, their resilience, and their newfound sense of unity. As James stood among his friends and neighbors, watching kids play and laughter fill the air, he realized that he had gained something even more valuable than the right to keep his garden. He had helped create a true community, one that would never let corruption take root again. As time passed, James' role in transforming the neighborhood became a story that new residents heard when they moved in. His fight against the corrupt HOA became a symbol of what could be achieved when people stood together against injustice. People often stopped by his house, not just to admire his flourishing garden, but to thank him for standing up when no one else dared. Even though James had never sought out leadership, he found himself at the heart of the community, someone neighbors turned to when they needed advice or guidance. Eleanor, the elderly neighbor whose financial records had been instrumental in taking down Nancy and Robert, often sat with James on his porch, reminiscing about how far things had come. "You know, James," she said one afternoon, sipping her tea, "you could have just given up and moved away." "Most people would have." James nodded, thinking about all the times he had been tempted to do just that. "I thought about it," he admitted. "But this place isn't just a house to me. It's my family's history. I wasn't going to let them take that away." Eleanor smiled, nodding in understanding. "And because of that, you gave all of us a better idea of a community garden, first proposed after the downfall of the HOA, had started as a small project with just a few volunteers. But as word spread, more and more people wanted to be involved. With some of the recovered HOA funds, the neighborhood association was able to secure an unused lot and officially turn it into a shared green space where everyone could grow food. James took on a leadership role in the project, using his gardening expertise to help others learn. What had once been an empty, neglected piece of land soon transformed into a thriving community space filled with raised garden beds, fruit trees, and even a small greenhouse. Families who had never grown anything before were now harvesting fresh vegetables for their meals. Children learned how to plant and take care of crops, and neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now worked side by side, building something meaningful together. James often spent his mornings at the garden, helping with planting, troubleshooting pest problems, or simply enjoying the sight of so many people working together. One day, as he stood admiring the lush rows of tomatoes and peppers, a woman who had recently moved into the neighborhood approached him. "I heard about everything you did," she said. "This place, it's amazing. Thank you for fighting for it." James just smiled, gesturing toward the thriving plants. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "This is what happens when people come together." Even though the neighborhood had moved on from Nancy and Robert's reign of terror, their legal troubles were far from over. After their initial convictions, deeper investigations uncovered even more financial crimes. It turned out that their corruption extended beyond just James' neighborhood. They had been involved in similar scams in other communities, using the same tactics to manipulate homeowners and siphon funds. When the full extent of their fraud was revealed, their prison sentences were extended. What had originally been a few years behind bars turned into a much longer punishment, ensuring they would never be able to exploit another community again. While most people in the neighborhood stopped thinking about them, occasionally their names would come up, usually when someone joked about how much better life was without them. One day, James received a letter in the mail from an unfamiliar sender. He opened it to find a short note from Robert, written from prison. "You think you won," it read. "But people like me always find a way back." James shook his head, unimpressed. He threw the letter in the trash without a second thought. Robert and Nancy were relics of the past, nothing more than a bad memory. The future belonged to the people who had taken back their neighborhood, and no empty threat was going to change as the years passed. The neighborhood only grew stronger. The once feared HOA had been replaced with a fair, transparent homeowners association, run by people who genuinely cared about the community. Monthly meetings were open to everyone, and decisions were made collectively, with no room for corruption or abuse of power. The community garden flourished, new trees were planted along the sidewalks, and families felt safe knowing that their neighborhood was now in good hands. James had become something of a local legend, but he never let the recognition change him. He still spent his days working in his garden, sharing his produce with neighbors, and helping newcomers feel welcome. Every so often, he would look out over the thriving greenery and remember how close he had come to losing it all. But standing his ground had been worth it, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood, he saw a young boy helping his mother water their garden in their front yard. James smiled, remembering how Nancy had once tried to claim that gardens didn't belong in the neighborhood. Now they were everywhere. The battle he had fought had changed things for good, ensuring that no one would ever be bullied out of their own home again. Life moved on, but the lessons of the past were never forgotten. Every year, at the annual block party, someone would mention the events that had led to the community's transformation. People would raise their glasses in a quiet toast to James, Eleanor, and everyone who had stood up against corruption. It was a reminder of how fragile a community could be when placed in the wrong hands, and how strong it could become when people united for a common cause. James, now older and wiser, often found himself sitting on his porch, watching the neighborhood he had helped save. He had never set out to be a hero. He had just wanted to grow his vegetables in peace. But in fighting for that simple right, he had helped an entire community find its voice. One evening, Eleanor sat beside him once again, just as she had so many times before. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had just given up?" she asked. James chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah," he said. "But I'm glad I didn't." The neighborhood was thriving. The gardens were growing. The people were happy.